We're going to do kind of an overall conversation that's not directly related to the Tanya. It's more of a theological conversation that we're going to tie back into the Tanya. We're going to be starting chapter 6 today. Last week, I gave an overview of chapter 5 of Sharif and Vemuna, of the Gateway of Unity and Faith. And we're actually toward the end of chapter 5. But chapter 5 was more of a parenthesis, and I don't want to lose the focus. So I gave a general overview of chapter 5, and you're welcome to listen to the recording. It's on our website already. If you weren't here or present for it, but I want to make sure we keep forward, and that's going to be chapter 6. The chapters are getting a little more in depth. We're talking about the creation of God and understanding the depth of creation, and by understanding that, we'll also understand the depths and the getting to the bottom of creation and understanding as much as we can in our limited capacity, understanding God. That's really what we are having a conversation about. And as the chapters progress, we're getting more and more in depths of that, into the depths of that conversation. My goal is, as we conclude these chapters, right now we're up to chapter 6. I may more or less give an overview of the chapters and not go through every line, even though this is more or less a text-based class. There's other things that I want to get into when we finish this section or finish this conversation. So having said that, some of the later chapters are so in depth that I may just give an overview of how I understand it and from my teachers, how it's understood. And then we're going to go into a different conversation, a different discussion that I feel is so needed for the world now. So my point is, after we finish these chapters of Tanya, my goal is to go into a very important study that's almost 1,000 years old, called Shar HaBitachon, which means the gateway of trust in God. I really feel that where the world is now and where the world is, the direction of the world, we need more and more trust in God. And this is a book, Shar HaBitachon, that's literally 900 and some years old, coming from the duties of faith. One of the duties is called Shara B'tachon, the gateway of trust in God. So I do want to get into that when we finish this discussion. So we'll see how it goes. The Tanya is going to get more and more detailed and in depth. So I may just give an overview of chapters and do certain parts inside, and as we continue the conversation. So, okay, so in chapter 6, which we're going to be discussing today, I want to bring it in more as a theological discussion, but it's going to be a foundation for the chapters that we are going to be discussing over the next few weeks. One of the most significant and famous questions that for millennia has been debated about God is, does God have a character? In the Torah, it says God was happy with what was going on, or God's wisdom. Does God think? Is God wise? Is God happy? Or is God, it says a vengeance. What does that mean for God? In a primitive way, we could say that we are mirroring God, as I've said a few times in the previous chapters, or actually maybe it's in our JLI class at night, that the 10 Sefirot, which is the way of how the building blocks of how God created the world, is also mirroring in how God created us. So God uses 10 faculties or attributes in creation of the world. It's called the 10 Sefirot, the 10 lights that God expressed in creation. And God made us in his image. And therefore, we also have those 10 soul powers, starting with the 3 intellectual ones, Chachma, Bina, and Das, and then 7 emotional attributes of chesed, kindness, and love, and gevura, which is more discipline or justice. Then we have compassion, empathy, and beauty, which is the combination of the two. We're not going to get into all of them now, but we mirror God, and therefore, if we have them, that means to some degree God also has that character. But obviously, that's hard to understand, because one of the most famous axioms is God is one, Hashem Echad. one doesn't just mean there's one and not two gods. One means that God in himself is indivisible. There's no parts to God. So it would be hard to explain that God has a character when, a person, when they have a character of love, that's what's being expressed, and not the character of fear or the character of hate or the character of envy. You can't have two at one. So if God is indivisible, how would God have a character? So, when the Torah says God regretted what he did, what does that mean? God is compassionate. What does that mean? So does God have feelings? So in general, there's two schools of thought to explain, to answer this question of what does it mean that does God have a character? There's the philosophical answer, and then there's the Kabbalistic or the mystical answer. We'll start with the a more philosophical way, again within Torah, but there's a mode of philosophy to understand it, and then we're going to get into um, which is more the human mind of how we can understand it, and then we're going to get more into the divine truth, which is more the way the Kabbalists want to see it. So the philosophers would say that God has no character. However, God created tools, or let's call them angels, which becomes the way of how God relates to the world. So God himself doesn't have a character of anger or a character of love or a character of happiness. But God uses tools in order to relate to the world. To use it to explain it in the words of the Rambam, Maimonides, who in general, the Maimonides, the Rambam uses a much more philosophical way of understanding God. In one of the most famous books of the Rambam, besides for his magnum opus called Mishnah Torah, the Rambam also wrote towards the end of his life in the 1190s. I think he passed away in 1204. So in the last decade of the Rambam's life, um, the Rambam wrote a book called The Guide to the Perplexed. And that's more a book on Jewish philosophy. Very, very complex, very, very deep. The Rambam was actually very particular if and how it should be translated, because the Rambam didn't want, if one word is mistranslated, it could almost sound heretical. So it had to be very, very carefully translated, and there's very limited amount of translations even till today. But the Rambam explains that you can't say God is wise, you can't say God is kind, because God doesn't lack anything. So when we name an emotional trait in God, it's really just our interpretation. We perceive God as acting kind. So we name it kindness because that's how we perceive it. But God himself is beyond kindness. Because if you were to say God is kind and God from God, then it may almost seem like God is lacking something. So the way we perceive God is a God of kindness or a God of love. But from the perspective of God, we relate to God in that way, but God himself is beyond any of those expressions. But Kabbalah, which is going to be what we're going to be focusing on more over here in our class, we can't settle with that answer because Kabbalah looks for divine truth. It looks for precision. So we don't settle for simplification. It's more of a simple answer. Obviously, there's a lot of depth in it, but it's more of a simple answer to say that from our perspective, God is relatable, or we are able to relate to God in a way of giving expression, a way of giving attributes, in a way of saying God is kind, because that's how we relate to it. When there's an act of kindness, we refer to it as kind, and therefore God is kind. But the Kabbalah is looking at the Torah as literal, and it can't be a tool that God uses or an angel that God uses. It can't be our interpretation of God. We're looking for the truth of God. So we're going to introduce over here a much more novel way of understanding what does it mean God's character, and not one that only we could relate to, but trying to understand in the truth of God, what does it mean if God has a character? And the way it's explained is understanding what we know, what I've just mentioned a few minutes ago, of the 10 Sefirot, the 10 supernal lights of God. Um, and from the way God emits these lights are Ein Sof. Each of these 10 lights have no end to it. These lights themselves are extremely powerful lights that have no limit to the light. It's an Ein Sof, which means it's a non-ending light. I'm going to have to unpack what this means. What does it mean you have a light that has no limit, and when did it have a limit? So give me a little bit of time to explain it, and hopefully we'll see it a little bit in the chapter 6, um, how it relates to our discussion. But before Kabbalah was introduced, before Kabbalah was taught and learned, there was God, and there was what's non-God, what we refer to as outside of God. Of course, nothing is outside of God, and that's a very big part of our conversation here. But there was no middle ground. Either it's part of God or it's outside of God. Kabbalah is the one that's introducing us to the idea here that there's God, there's creation that may seem outside of God, and then there's something in the middle where we're going to refer to as godliness. It's not God, but it's not outside of God, it's godliness. We're referring to that here in Kabbalistic terms. It's going to be referred to as light. I'm just going to give a little bit of a spoiler. God's light. It's not God, but it's the light coming from God. I want to explain that. And let's just start with God. God is an existence that transcends any limitations of existence. So it's not an existence the way we could relate to existence. It's above and beyond any existence that we know. Creation, on the other hand, is totally limited. It's limited in time, limited in space. Creation by very nature is self-centered and egoic. It's all about what we see and what we know and what we feel. But there's a middle ground in between God and creation. And that middle ground in Kabbalah, in Kabbalistic terms, it's referred to as or, which is a light. And they chose the word light to explain this middle ground. From the Arizal, from Rabbi Isaac Luria, he explains why is light the method used to explain this middle ground? Because if you look at light, all light is saying is, look at my source. Light is saying, I'm nothing. All I'm doing is reflecting the source. So if there were a label or if you're able to have a conversation with light, all light would scream to you is, meet my source. That's what I'm here to show you is my source. That by very nature is what light does. And at the same time, what light is telling you is that all I am is a ray. I'm not the source. I'm just a reflection of the source. Meet my source, but I'm not my source. I'm an extension of my source, but I'm not the source. I'm just a ray of the light. So we have the luminary, which is the source of light, and that's beyond our reach. But what God gave us within our reach is the light of God. So the divine light, this light of God, which in Hebrew we refer to, in Kabbalah we refer to as Sefirot, those lights are as perfect as God himself because they are a reflection of God. The difference is that we can appreciate this light. It's something more that's relatable to us. So while God is something what we would refer to over here as beyond our reach, God gave us a light that's almost that middle ground that us as a creation, as a created existence, we could relate to it. So the lights of God is almost carrying God in a relatable way. So Kabbalah says, just to reiterate this point, I just want to explain to you the answer. Does God have a character? The answer in Kabbalah is no, absolutely not. God does not have a character. God has no description. That's the exact opposite of what God is. God is beyond description. God is indivisible. God is all one. God does not have a character. But his light that God emanates with God, the light of God, or that light of God does have a character. So when there's a, a descriptive attribute to God in the Torah, it's actually the way God is in his light, the way we could relate to God in the Sefirot. So Hashem, God, remains beyond attributes, but in a way, his character is still part of God. They are God's expression. So God, as God relates to himself, does not have expression, but God's light, which he chose to bring into the world that is part of God, that does have a description, that does have an expression. Okay, I just want to pause there, and it's a very deep Kabbalistic idea. And just to summarize it, what we're explaining is that God has Sefirot. These Sefirot are infinite lights of God, and they're directly from God. And that's why they're infinite, because they are God's light. They are a pure reflection of God, but obviously they're not God. They're godliness. So the Kabbalah refers to godliness, or a middle ground between God and world. There's our existence that we know that is limited in time and space. And then there's God that's beyond any limitation, obviously. So how there's a middle ground in between. That middle ground we're referring to as the Sefirot, or the lights of God, that God chose to express himself through these lights. So in the Torah, when there's an expression of God, or God as a character, it's not God himself, it's the expressions of God coming through these lights. And that's something we could relate to. Any questions so far? I know it's a deep idea. I want to try to tie it back into what the chapter is about. Right now, it's more of just a theological discussion, but I'm going to try to relate it back over here. Okay. Um, so in order to bring this back all together, I told you there's 10 lights. But if they are a pure emanation of God, it would be insulting to say by God there's 10 parts to anything. God is one. So if it's a direct light of God, you would say it's one light that God shines. Why 10? How does that work? So the most powerful word that I want to bring across to you today, it's such an incredible word. And in Kabbalah, it's a very important word. Light, or, is a very important word in Kabbalah. Sefirot is a very important word in Kabbalah. And this following word is another very important word. And we're going to see it in the chapter, and that's where I want to tie it in. The word in Hebrew is the word hitkalalut. It comes from the word kalal, or really from the word kol, which means everything. Klal would mean all-inclusive, like everything together. And hitgalalut would mean integration, or interconnectedness, or harmony. Hitgalalut is how everything is part of each other, how everything is within each other, in total integration with each other. And so it's a deep idea, and I want to try to explain it how it relates to the chapter. The fact that the lights of God, which we're saying has 10 parts to it, which seems to be a limitation, that it's 10 and not one, what Kabbalah explains is that itself is a manifestation of the infinite. Um, I explained this in my JLI class last Wednesday night, so I just want to explain to you this in a few words. Adam and Eve, when they had the original sin, the sin of the tree of knowledge, Eitz Hadas Tov Ra, what they brought into the world is an entanglement where there's no good without some evil, or bad, and there's no bad without some good. There's everything became entangled, and it's a much harder process to try to separate the good from the bad. And that's why you could have someone who you vehemently disagree with, but some of what they're saying could be good, could be true. But it's so hard for you to separate the person from their words. because there's an entanglement, and that happened already from the beginning of creation by the sin of Adam and Eve. So that wasn't by default. By default, the good is good and the bad is bad. It's also a creation of God, but it was easy to separate, and it was easy for a person to know what's good for them and what's not good for them. Now there's an entanglement where everything is almost mixed up within each other, and that brought dysfunction to the world. The ideal of creation is that um, that entanglement, we want to get back to how it was originally, where the good is separated from the bad, or to be further, the ideal of creation is that there's a perfect fusion between what seems as infinite and what is finite. Mashiach will be that perfect fusion of what seems as absolute holy will be able to come into this world. There's a fusion between what seems as infinite and what's finite are able to be fully merged and connected together. That's called hitgalalut, where there's a pure integration between everything. So when Adam and Eve, they brought a dysfunction to the world, where everything got mixed up in a dysfunctional way. When Mashiach comes, there will be a perfect fusion of everything in the most harmonious and perfect way. Sifirot, when I say there's 10 lights, that's exactly the ideal state of Mashiach, which is that there's a fusion of all the lights within each other. So there is 10, but within the 10, there's each one. So the 10 is one and the one is 10. I don't know if I'm explaining this properly. It's a very deep Kabbalah idea, but I'm just going to try it. That's hitgalalut, where there's an integration. Usually when you have one and then you have two, the two is not one and the one is not two. The perfect integration is when each one is within the other. So even though it's 10, it's really all part of one. And even though it's one, it's really a perfect 10. In Hebrew, that's called hitgalalut, when there's an interconnectedness between all of it. What I want to try to bring out of this for our chapter is what seems like a tzimtzum, what seems like divine concealment, is actually going to be in our conversation today going to be part of the greatness of creation. Usually, when a parent is kind, he's being kind. When a parent is strict, he's being strict. To say that there's kindness in a strictness seems to, go either the parent is being kind or he's being strict. But to say there's love in that strictness is such a beautiful integration or hitkalalut that we see in creation. So when God acted with justice, it's hard for us to see, but that justice is actually integrated with absolute pure love. So the tzimtzum is not a holdback on creation. We usually translate the tzimtzum as divine concealment or a divine squeeze, that God held himself back and didn't just give. And what we're saying here is that itself is the novelty of creation. Tzimtzum is actually a part of the interconnectedness of creation. In terms of the chapter, the way the Alter Rebbe is going to talk about this is in terms of God's names. We explained in the past that God has 7 holy names. The 2 famous ones that we're talking about today is God, how he spelled Yud, Hey, Vav, and Hey, which in Kabbalistic terms is referred to as Havaya, which means God acting in kindness and creation of the world. It's in holy terms, it's referred to as God's tetragrammaton. When this name was mentioned in the temple, everyone would fall on their face when the Kohen Gadol would say this name. And we are not allowed to say this name until Mashiach comes. And then it will be said again and uttered again in the temple. But until then, we don't have the capacity as a vessel to be able to say that name and sustain ourselves. So it's almost wrong, not almost, we're not allowed to say the name of God how he is in Havaya. So instead of saying God's name, we say Havaya, which are the same four letters just mixed around. The first letter is really a Yud, but instead we say Havaya. Havaya is the name of God that is bringing light into the world. The name of God that is bringing creation into bringing about creation. Then we had the name Elokim. Elokim is another name of God that is all about concealment. In Hebrew, the letters of Elokim is an Aleph, Lamed, Hey, Yud, and Mem, 5 letters. Those 5 letters of Elokim actually are the numerical value of 86. And we know in Torah and numerology, all letters have a number, and when one word equals a certain amount of a certain number, and another word equals the same amount, the same number, there's a connection between those two. So if Elokim equals 86, if you have the Aleph, which is 1, the Lamed, which is 30, the Hey, which is 5, the Yud, which is 10, and the Mem, which is 40, you get 86. Another word in Hebrew that also has the same number, the same 86, the numerology of 86, is the word Hateva. Hateva means nature, God's nature. And Hateva also equals 86. And what that is telling you is Elokim is God being veiled within nature, God being hidden in creation. That's Elokim, God being veiled, God being hidden in nature. The beauty of what we're trying to do is to show us in this chapter how Havaya, which is the name of God that is, so to speak, creating, and the name of God Elokim, which is veiled or concealing, all of that is interconnected in creation. It's not that there's one that is creating and one name of God that is holding back. Both are part of creation of God. Both are part of God. That integration or interconnectedness is that God is indivisible as one, and all of that is God as creation, God connecting to the world. To pause there for a moment, one of the most famous instances of biblical in the Torah is the famous story of Elijah, to the point where in our prayers on any fast day, when we say Slichot, we say a penitent prayer, we say, God, answer us as God answered the Jews at the splitting of the sea. God, answer us as you answered Joshua by the story of the sun when they had the war. God, answer us as he answered Elijah in Har Carmel. What was the story of Elijah at Har Carmel? So there was a story of there were many false prophets during the temple times, and it caused a tremendous amount of corruption and confusion amongst the Jewish people. And not many, but some of the kings of Israel were actually falling for them, and actually, instructed the Jews to worship the false, to listen to the false gods, to the false prophets that were saying false prophecies. One of the famous kings that did this was Achav, and he lived during the time of the prophet Elijah. And there was this huge argument, and Elijah had to run away to save his life from Achav, who wanted to kill him. But one of the famous showdowns is with Elijah and the false prophets in the north of Israel, in Har Carmel, in the Carmel, Mount Carmel, where there were many Jews there and there were many false prophets. And they said, let's see whose God answers. And they worshiped their God and they built altars and nothing happened. And Elijah brought an offering to God in the afternoon, and all he said was a small prayer, and God answered him. And all the Jews saw that, and they came back to God's side. And the famous words that they said was Havaya hu Elokim. God is God. That was what they said. So they said Havaya, which is one name of God, and they said Elokim, the other name of God. But what they said is Havaya hu Elokim. God is God, but it doesn't sound as good in English. But in Hebrew, what they were saying is this name of God and that name of God are all one. The last moments of Yom Kippur, what are the last words we say before we break our fast and we blast the shofar? It's the last moments when the ark is open at the end of Yom Kippur, which is by Ne'ilah, the last closing moments when the sun is setting, the sun set already. We say the Shema one time. We say the Baruch Shem 3 times, and then we say those 3 words from this verse from Elijah. We say Havaya Hu Halakim. We say 7 times. We say it over and over 7 times. I don't know if for those that were here in show, that's what we were saying. What we're trying to do in this chapter is emphasizing this point that Havaya and Elokim is all one. They're not separate parts, or they're not, one is the creating part of God and one is the holding back part of God. That Tzimtzum is part of creation. All of it is part of the indivisible God. So just to take a step back and bring this, how do we talk about this? Right now, we're up to chapter 6 of Shar HaYichud Ve'emunah, which is the gateway of unity and faith in God. We're learning how to understand God's oneness. What does it mean God is one? That Hashem Echad. So we started in chapter 1, 2, and 3 by explaining that God is constantly involved in creation, because creation is a quantum change. What does a quantum change means? Means like the splitting of the sea, that for it to remain upright when water usually is down, you need a constant wind pushing it to remain upright. For a change to happen from the rock throwing, usually the rock is sitting. For it to be thrown, it needs that constant energy keeping it moving forward. And we said by God and creation, that's even more. So for a quantum change to happen, which the default setting is nothing, null and void, for there to be a creation, it's not just that God could create once and let it be, which is how the rest of the creation is, right? You create a table, you don't have to be creating it every moment. You create it once and then it stands on its own. But God needs to constantly be creating in order to keep creation vivified, in order to keep creation in existence. And God does that through the speech with which God created the world, the 10 utterances. Then we continued in chapter 3 that we are created from God and we are constantly within God. And then the question we ended chapter 3 was, if we are constantly within God, how do we have a self-identity? How do we have a feeling of independence? How do we have an ego if we're within God? So then the Tanya in chapter 4 introduces the Tzimtzum, which is that concealment of God, that on one hand we're within God, but on the other hand, God in his incredible creation left no trace of himself in creation. Every author or when we create something, there's a trace. You trace it back to where that there's a creator to this. But in creation, God left no trace, or we could choose to think there's no trace of God in creation. That's because God concealed himself. So on one hand, God keeps us in the source, but on the other hand, we could feel like we're out of the source because God kept no trace of himself in creation. So chapter 6, which we're now up to, it puts it in the following context of God's names. That it's Tzimtzum, we can understand it in the context of God's name and names. Havaya, which is the tetragrammaton, the holy name of God, is the creating force. And actually the word in Hebrew, hoveh, or lehavot, means to bring into existence. It means to be present in order to create. Elokim is the other name of God, which is the concealing force, which allows an illusion of nature, allows an illusion of ourself. So until now, what we have been learning is God employs both forces in creation. God reveals and God conceals. But until now, we could still think that they're independent forces. There's God how he creates, and then there's God how he conceals. There's God through Havaya, and he conceals through Elokim. But now, hit galalut means that full integration or harmony within God. It teaches us that even in concealment, that's part of the force in creation. That Havaya, that Elokim is part of Havaya. Havaya, hu Elokim, Havaya is part of Elokim, and Elokim is part of Havaya. Because it's all within one God, and God is indivisible. And therefore, they're one within each other. It's an act of kindness that God creates, but it's also an act of severity. or in what we would refer to as tough love. When a parent is doing something with their child that may seem tough, but really it's love. It's an act of discipline, but it's also really an act of love. Thank you. And that's Elokim, where it seems tough, but it's really an expression of love. So Elokim is not just an expression of God's severity, it's also an expression of God's love, because Elokim and Avaya are all one. And this explains the verse. What's beautiful about in Hasidus, and you see this by the Rebbe's discourses over and over, it starts with a verse of the Torah. It brings a question on the verse, it explains the Kabbalistic idea, and then it answers the question. So the same over here in chapter 1 of Tanya, it brought a verse that's from the book of Deuteronomy that we quote in our Aleinu, in the concluding prayer of our services. We conclude with Aleinu, which says the following verse from Deuteronomy, V'yadaita hayom, that we should know today, V'yeshevota levecha, we should place it on our hearts, Ki havaya hu Elokim, that God is God, that Havaya is Elokim. In the heavens above, Hashemayim imal, and in the earth below, all of it is God, or that Havaya is Elokim. That's the verse that's from Deuteronomy, and the question we had at the beginning of Tanya is there a place that you could say that God is not God? That we know that God is God. What does that mean? Would we think that there's a different God, like that the verse has to come and solidify and make it clear to us? It doesn't sound so complicated. So the answer over here is that hidden in those words is saying that we would think that Havaya is God's revelation, Elokim is the veil or the concealment, the curtain, the illusion, the hiding force, and the contemplation we have to have in those words is to have mindfulness or to meditate, to recognize that even the illusion or the concealment that God brings, the tzimtzum that God brings, even that is part of God. That it's all fused together. And we have to have the mindfulness to look behind the veil or behind the mask to see godliness even in the place of concealment. Even in the concealment, to know that it is part of God, that it's Elokim, and that is Havaya. That's part of the creating force. That's part of God. So from our perspective, it may seem like a veil, but from God's perspective, and that's where I'm going back to the beginning, the theology, where there's the light of God, where allows us to relate to God, and it may seem like separate, but really from God's perspective, it's all one. The Elokim and Havaya are all one. And that's our mindfulness that we have to have in that meditation on that verse, is that Elokim is part of Havaya. That even what seems like tzimtzum, what seems like a challenge, what seems like a hardship, what seems like the veil and a concealment of God is part of God. So tzaddikim, they have that. A tzaddik is one that inherently sees that. King David, he reached that level where in all of his hardships, he saw God and he was able to sing. He was able to thank God for his hardships. Or to quote David, he says this powerful verse. He says, Oitcha Hashem ki anaftabi. Thank you, God, for you have been angry with me. Even in the place that seemed like anger of God, David was able to say thank you. A tzaddik is able to see in times of suffering that seems like a total tzimtzum of God, how that itself is God. And that's because from God's perspective, it's all good. It's just from our perspective, we don't see it. A tzaddik could see it. He sees beyond the veil. The mindfulness that we are trying to reach in chapter 6 is that Havaya hu Elokim, which is the verse from the Torah, that in the Elokim, you really see Havaya. That it's all fused together. That the whole tzimtzum is only from our perspective, but from God's perspective, it's all one. And this is our ultimate, is to achieve this to see beneath the veil. Ultimately, that's going to happen when Mashiach comes. But our job is to be able to see it now also, to have the meditation, to see how Tzimtzum is actually also part of God's love. That even here, God is completely revealed as he is above. So that's some deep stuff. Let me see if we could even squeeze some of that inside. I'm going to pull up the Kindle, but what I'm going to try to... Oh, you're welcome, Nancy. What I'm going to try to do is just bring some of the practical lessons of chapter 6 and see if that helps us with what we just explained. If you have your book handy, look on page 67. We're just going to read some of the practical lessons and Hasidic thoughts. We're going to go through those and see if what I just explained over the past 45 minutes fits in with what we are going to learn inside. I'm also going to try to see if it's at the back of the chapter in the Kindle. Let's see. For now, I'm just going to read it inside. If you could look on page 67 and tell me if that fits in with what you could see inside. Here we go. Oops. Okay, so for those that want to look inside, I just found it on the screen. Practical lessons. The divine name, Elokim, represents diminishment or tzimtzum, the veil of nature, hiding God's overwhelming power. So that's Elokim. If you turn the page on 68 now, this is a Hasidic thought, so it's not in the practical lessons. I'm just going to read it in the book itself. If you have it on 68, it reads like this. God diminished his light, so to speak, like a father who diminishes his intellect and speaks childish things to engage with his toddler. The father behaves in all sorts of childish ways, and the father even loves this childishness so that the child should enjoy being with him. And that's from the Maggid of Mezrich. It's a famous parable, but that's again God's diminishment of light is part of that relationship that he wants to have with the child. And the father loves it. He loves being childish because he's relating to his child. Okay, let's read the next practical lesson. Giving, which is chesed, kindness, and restraint, which is gevura, are really inseparable. You must hold back one part of yourself in order to give another part of yourself. Restraint is, in essence, is part of the giving. The same is true of God. His restraint, which is Elokim, is really a type of divine disclosure and giving Havaya. So that's going to be the novelty of chapter 6, that Elokim is not really holding back of God. Elokim is part of the revelation. The Tzimtzum is part of the disclosure, part of the giving, part of Havaya. The Elokim is part of Havaya. We'll continue now on page 70, a Hasidic thought. I only have an independent mind because God's presence is concealed. If at any moment he were to reverse this, space and time would implode, since the distinctions which make finite existence possible would be erased. My consciousness is, in a sense, a lie. My separate mind can only exist because God has hidden his presence. If that veil is removed, I will be reabsorbed in his oneness. On the other hand, this is a real book, and I am reading it. The world really does exist. It is not an illusion. God actually did create the heavens and the earth. My very consciousness, and therefore every object and experience it perceives, is both true and a lie at the very same time. It is true because the world is real, but it is a lie because my reality can only exist if divine concealment, which is a lie, is in place. This is such a Jewish idea where you need both at the same time to be able to understand something. On one hand, the consciousness I have is a lie because it's just a perception, it's a veil, but our goal is to be absorbed in God's oneness. But on the other hand, it's real. I'm reading a book. It does exist. It's not an illusion. So you need both at the same time. You need to linger on that thought for a little bit. But we're just going to continue with the next practical lesson on page 72. You could also see it in the Kindle, I think. Even when God hides himself, it is an expression of God, and therefore, type of revelation. God is in the pain as well as the pleasure. That's one of the hardest things to swallow, one of the hardest things to grasp, but that's Havaya and Elokim at the same time. That God is anyway, I don't want to reiterate it, but that's a very deep idea. And then the next part I didn't explain, that much, but we're still just going to read the practical lesson so we could say that we did the chapter. If you look at this practical lesson on page 75 or the bottom of the Kindle, God's relationship to the world is not like your soul's relationship with your body. Your body only depends on your soul for life energy. It does not depend on it for existence, right? The body could exist without a soul. For it to have an energy, you need a soul. But we know that a soul could leave the body, and yet the body still exists. It's lifeless, doesn't have that energy, but it's still able to exist without the soul. God's relationship to the world is obviously a lot more, where the world can't exist without that divine fusion in it. A Hasidic thought on page 76. From God's perspective, his infinite light is really here the whole time. It has just become concealed from us. God made a veil that fooled us, but it didn't fool him. And that's good news. God's concealment is really a matter of perspective, an eclipse of the mind rather than a true eclipse of God, which means it's easier to reverse. If God had built real barriers, they would be harder to smash down. But his concealment is really a matter of perspective, and a perspective can always be changed. So that's why it's good news, because it's a matter of perspective that can be changed. But the truth is that it's not real, meaning that it didn't fool God, it only fooled us, and therefore we could change our perspective. And I think this is the final one. Let me just, if you want to see it on the Kindle, it's going to be at the top of the page now. God's power of diminishment is only real from our perspective. It hides nothing from him. So that's diminishment, is that tzimtzum, right? Tzimtzum is only from our perspective, but for God, there is no tzimtzum. It's like, it's a bit like a snail's shell. To outsiders, the shell conceals what's inside. But to the snail, the shell is part of its body, which is a pretty cool example. I don't think that example is inside the Tanya. That's a pretty good, nice example. So I'm just going to conclude with this. What we came to the conclusion after this long discussion from chapter 4, 5, and 6, it was a deep dive into Tzimtzum. Tzimtzum is the divine squeeze or the divine concealment, the contraction of God's light. The conclusion that we've come to is that squeeze or that concealment is only from our perspective, but it's not real. From God's perspective, it's not there. And even from our perspective, what we have to tap into is to see that even that concealment that we see as concealment is actually part of God. It is godliness. It's not something that hides over godliness. That is also the power of Gevura is integrated or interconnected, Hitkalut, with the power of Chesed. It says in the Tehillim in chapter 119 of Psalms, it says, Olam Chesed Yibaneh, which means the world was built with kindness. So we see that God created the world with kindness. But integrated with that was also the power of Tzimtzum. All of it is one with the other. That's the power of Sefirot, that it's all one with each other. Let's just take some questions. How is real defined in these contexts? Ooh, that's a good one, Adrian. Meaning there's the reality, what's real, the way we see it, and then there's the reality of God, right? On one hand, it's really just an illusion, and it's not real. But on the other hand, it's real that we could see it. It's a good question. I think that's the one, going back and forth. Is what we see reality, or is what we see an illusion? And I think when we are able to tap beneath the veil of the Tzimtzum and see it from God's perspective, we will see that even Tzimtzum, it's not the illusion that we see the truth is what's real is the way God sees it, and we're trying to tap into that ourselves. Um, so it's hard to say what the real is defined as, because there's the reality the way we see it, and then there's the reality the way God sees it. And when we are able to tap beneath, beyond the veil, tap beneath, under the mask, we're able to see the reality the way God is. That Havaya and Elokim are all one. So there's almost like a dual reality, with the way we see it, which could be an illusion. I don't know if I'm answering your question. It's a hard one. It's a short question, but it's kind of exactly what we're struggling with in this chapter, right? Exodus 34, is that about Moshe asking God, "Let me see your glory," about the by the rock? Or
Right. So are those, is that light? Are those emanations? It sounds like God, Hashem is explaining. I always thought of it as like the characters or the midot. So
yeah,
you said that's not God. So can you share how those are connected, please?
right. So the words that in that verse, the words Moshe asks for, "Hareini nat kevodecha," let me see your glory. Right? It
Right.
didn't say, "Let me
Glory.
see you." Let me see your glory, or I think that's the English kvodecha. I think would be
Hmm.
translated
Hmm.
as glory. Again, that's God's light, right? And even to that degree, God answered, "You're not able to see it." Meaning, when Mashiach comes, that's I think the point. Thank you, Lynn, for bringing that up. When Mashiach comes, there will be that perfect fusion of God and His character, God and His light. From our perspective, it's hard for us to see that full integration, how it's really all one, how the Tzimtzum is all part of God. When Mashiach comes, there'll be that perfect fusion. Our job is to, have that consciousness or that mindfulness, like Moshe did, right? That's what Moshe was trying to do. He was trying to bring that integration, and ultimately, it will happen when Mashiach comes. And what did God tell him? You could see my back, which means no matter how much we try, we'll never see the depth of it. I think that's the whole beauty of this, section of Tanya, is as much as we can, we have the obligation to try to pursue it, and we'll still never get to it. We'll never get to the precision of understanding godliness or God. But I think what this chapter helps us is understanding that godliness, which is the light of God, is perfectly one with God, Hashem, that it's echad, it's one, right? What's the verse that we say at the end of Aleinu? Hashem echad u'shmo
Hashem is
echad.
God.
So
Eternal.
God is one, and His name is one till Mashiach comes. So the words of that, Aleinu, is Bayom Ahu Yiyeh. On that day, it will be seen how God and His name are one. Until then, we can't relate to it. We can't see the perfect fusion of God's name, which we're translating as tools or character of God, and God, how it's one. When Mashiach comes, there will be that perfect fusion of it all. And I think, that's where the Tzimtzum comes in, where it allows us that illusion of that separation or division, but we can't say there's any division in God. So we're trying to pursue and explore how it's all one, and go beneath the Tzimtzum, let's go behind the Tzimtzum. Um, and that's what the Kabbalists were struggling with, and understanding it through light. That on one hand, light is a full a reflection of the source, but on the other hand, it's only a ray of the source, and it's not the source.
Mhm.
It's only when Mashiach comes we'll be able to see that full interconnectedness.
I have a
Uh,
follow-up question though.
sure.
So if we're walking in the light of Hashem, Havaya, shouldn't our lives be reflecting that? Should we, like Moshe had, he was so reflective because he was panim al panim, he had to have the veil on. But shouldn't we have a sense of the way we're walking in the world, that our light would shine so brightly that others could see a reflection of Elohim, and
Absolutely.
we would give, what was that, kavod,
Yeah.
the Elohim, even if we're only connecting with the backside. So
Yeah.
can you maybe
Yeah.
share a few thoughts there?
Absolutely. And actually, as Shira mentioned last week about Moshe and the veil, right? Moshe was that full fusion of that combination. So therefore, it was visible on his face that he had to be veiled, because it was too much for us as human beings that are with that illusion or with that symptom to be able to relate to. But he was hoping to give that over to us, right? That was Moshe's, I wouldn't say disappointment, But Moshe was hoping that we were ready for that revelation. But we weren't. And everything, all Torah is connected. So tonight's class, we're giving our second class on the JLI. We're going to be talking about the rainbow. And I'll show a video tonight to explain it better. But that rainbow, how it's able to, have from the droplets, you're able to see different colors. It's again that reflection of the purity of light that we're trying to do in life. So Lynn, we're gonna talk about that more, God willing, tonight. The idea that when we're walking, that is our consciousness, is to be that reflection of divine, to be that light into the world, the way Moshe had it. Shira, did you have a question? Was that no?
Yeah.
Oh, and I love your shirt. I didn't even realize. Oh, very nice. Is that new or did you always have it?
No, it's new.
Wow. Okay, it's a good one. Shira has a shirt that says Am Yisrael Chai on it in Hebrew, which is definitely a good one to wear now.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll end class with that.
So Amazon is selling these little
sure.
flags. Oh, sorry. I just
No problem.
bought